Secret Motivations Behind Conduct, Center for Philosophical Research and Development lecture. We're all subject to pressures which manifest through personality tensions. In the old days, when majority of persons lived under a rather strict religious code, one of the teachings of that code was that a spiritual power or divine presence was aware of the workings of our mind and hearts. Deity was believed to judge us by our internal natures rather than by conduct alone. Under such conviction, individuals made a greater effort to keep the internal part of their lives in order. Today, we believe firmly that we can have secrets from each other, from the world, from ourselves, and from God. Thus, it has come about that we no longer regulate our internal motivations with the same sincerity that marked earlier and simpler times in which folks lived. So that which is no longer provided by religious training, and it's not very greatly assisted by our educational program, becomes a personal responsibility of the thoughtful person. I have never been much in favor of individuals attempting to psychoanalyze themselves. It is a very difficult process. And for the most part, we're not sufficiently detached to be strictly honest in such procedure. We are nearly always inclined to be a little kinder to our own faults than to the same faults in other persons. There is, however, something to be gained by occasional survey of our attitudes and our actions. It is good to know why certain habits arise within our thinking. It is appropriate to discover, if possible, the circumstances that force us away from what might be termed a norm or a reasonable pattern for living. This evening, therefore, we want to study a little bit into the problem of the secret motivations behind conduct. The first consideration, perhaps, is to determine the degree to which you might need such research. If your life is a well-organized one, if there are no unusual personality problems, if your natural tendency is to be reasonable in all things and to allow common sense to direct conduct, then in all possibility, you're not in great need of self-analysis. If, however, you do things which you cannot explain, even to yourself, you find your nature suddenly moved to some irrational attitude by pressures arising within yourself, if your relations with other persons are not fortunate, if pressures are arising in your home or in your business, if you observe rather strange intensities with which you cannot always cope efficiently, and in the end feel like the only answer is tranquilizing drugs, then you are really in need of a heart-to-heart talk with yourself. Motivations nearly always arise from attitudes which we have permitted to rise within our own natures. One of the most common of these attitudes in practice is the inferiority complex. The individual within himself feels inadequate. This feeling may or may not be justified. It may arise from a single pressurized incident which has destroyed or undermined self-confidence. It may also come from a long survey of circumstances and incidents, many of which seem to indicate that we are not adequate. Adequacy for our purpose means that we have reasonably contented relationships with our own abilities and capacities. Adequacy means that we feel within ourselves that we are sufficient to our needs. Adequacy will not always be complete. For thousands of years, men have sensed that they are never quite sufficient to their needs. It is because of this inferior realization that religions and philosophies have come to existence to assist the inner life of the person, and sciences to protect its physical existence. Inadequacy for the individual, however, is a very personal sense of insufficiency. The individual feels that this inadequacy may exist in one of many levels. We know, for example, the barrier of an unfortunate appearance. The individual who feels that nature has not been especially kind to him and has presented him with an asymmetrical body, irregular features, or something of this nature, may gain from these circumstances a strong sense of inferiority. Here, plastic surgery has proven a point well taken in psychology. There are individuals who went through life in a bitter conflict with themselves and nearly everyone else because their noses were too long or indeed too wide. This was just something that nobody could endure. There are historical and well-established records of individuals who lived for 40 or 50 years without ever looking in a mirror. They could not stand the shock. Also, there are cases where large and somewhat projecting hairs have undermined life and have made everything in the world seem a kind of dark, melancholy grey. Plastic surgery correcting these visible defects has frequently given persons a new release on self-confidence. There are also other signs by which we can gain a little insight. Nearly all the world's dictators have been small persons physically. Napoleon had special boots made so that he could get his head up high as the shoulders of his personal bodyguard. Little persons of physical frame seem to feel this smallness of body as a particular disadvantage. It gives them great drives, sometimes unreasonable and irrational drives, by means of which they hope to create a psychological image of themselves to lose all of the advantages and pleasures and comforts of a quiet, balanced existence. In Western living, we have built a great deal upon the importance of psychic drives, but we must recognize that persons are not equally endowed with this drive. Many people come into this world who are not especially competitive by natures. They do not really want to be a part of a pressured situation, and when they turn inside themselves, they do not have the psychic fuel, the libido, to continually force their way to successes. These persons would prefer to settle down in a moderate situation. They would like to enjoy life a little in quiet ways as they go on through the years. Yet, they are part of a very intense economic system. In order to maintain themselves economically, they have to force their psychic integration beyond its normal energy allotment. Such persons are miserable. They do not take any real interest in the things they're doing because these things demand more psychic energy than the individual has available. Under such conditions, if he forces the patterns, tries to release more energy than he naturally wishes to release, he becomes fatigued and exhausted. And the common symptom of these is the job changer. The person who, after a year or two at a particular job, feels himself completely out of tune with it. He no longer finds any reason for staying in that job. The moment these motivations begin to build and the attitude arise, the individual must then justify them. So, pressures must always be justified by some kind of attitudes, some philosophy of life that makes the individual appear to be right. When a situation is distasteful to him, he must have his own attitudes, his own convictions, and he must break away from the situation. In many cases, of course, the individual breaks away with the stated reason that he finds the job distasteful. What he's really doing in many instances, however, is excusing some type of personal limitation. If his training is not adequate, if his interests are not centered upon the field of activity in which he finds himself, if his personal life is discordant, then he begins to seek justifications for escape. Justification, perhaps, even for personal failure. This failure, of course, cannot be due to himself. It has to be due to something else. So, like varieties of philosophies built up around these unadjusted persons, instead of accepting the fact that they are unadjusted, they require themselves to accept that the world is unadjusted, that the situation they find themselves in at the moment is impossible. Well, there are cases where situations are impossible. There is no doubt about that. But under such patterns, the thoughtful person will look back over the years of his life. If he has merely moved from one impossible situation to another, then the chances are that the problem lies within himself. If his adjustments in life have always been inadequate, then he may as well face the fact that he is inadequate. You can, of course, insist and prove to a degree that the world in which we live is inadequate. This can be demonstrated and comes in very handy for the individual looking for excuses. At the same time, if we will look around him, he will find other persons doing a better job of living under these difficult situations than he is. If the man next to him, whose ideals are basically as good as his own, is able to handle himself better, then the person who is experiencing difficulties should pause and look into his own nature. The problem of motivation can arise from a wide diversity of causes. In our religious work, of course, we observe how often religion is used as an excuse for wrong motivations. While it should supply us with the highest motives that we know, it does not always do so. A person can take some fragment of a religious belief and use it to justify his own failure. It can use it to indicate beyond doubt that he is not in a place best for himself. With moderation, religion may help him. But if he uses it as a means of escaping, it is perverting the very foundation of religious principles. When we consider some of the types of experiences that we encounter working with persons who have these secret pressures, we already discussed before, so we'll pass over rather likely the fatigue syndrome. This is exceedingly common today. We are all dedicated to the realization that the world is wearing us out. There are few, however, that suspect that we are wearing the world out. In certain respects, it is true that we are under greater pressures than ever before. But there is doubt as to whether the world can wear out a normal person. The normal person has sufficient internal resource to realize that the world cannot destroy him unless he destroys himself first. Fatigue, therefore, is unadjustment, it is rebellion, it is a psychic form of suicidal impulse, the individual not doing what he wants to do, not having the adjustment with life which he deems to be necessary, finding himself blocked and frustrated by conditions beyond his apparent control, can very quickly develop a fatigue mechanism. One form of these mechanisms arises where the individual has no obvious escape from the things that perturbs him. The individual, for example, who sees in the future only the continuation of present problems, may very rapidly develop these negative attitudes. We notice this particularly among enthusiastic young people who raise large families too soon. After a certain number of children have been brought into the family, the problem of maintaining these young people, bringing them up, taking proper care of them until they reach majority, becomes so heavy a pattern of future responsibilities that is quite common today to find these families broken up by pressures. The person sees no reasonable solution. He sees no opportunity to be himself. He sees very little hope of ever spending the money that he earns for anything that he wants. Now, there are born parents to whom these problems are negligible. Their principal fulfillment in life is to raise children. They recognize it as a great social privilege rather than as a penalty. These persons carry with dignity large families, but those who are themselves less internally secure cannot carry this burden with the same dignity unless they go to work on themselves and straighten out their own thinking. The main point to be made is that having responsibilities too quickly and enthusiastically accepted will very often bring an individual suddenly face to face with a burden which frightens him, a burden which to him will destroy his own individual life, will force him to think only of others, and unless he is a pretty big person, this becomes a rather dangerous contemplation. We all want to be ourselves, and anything that would frustrate these gradually takes on a menacing and dangerous appearance. Another type of situation of this kind has to do with career. A person forced beyond his natural capacity very often gets into trouble. We know several instances, for example, where persons who basically and psychologically had very little interest in accumulating, that is, accumulating wealth, under the responsibility of an extravagant family, these individuals were forced to become highly money conscious. They had to use every device and strategy available to them, honorable or dishonorable, to increase income. Now, if the person is so naturally ambitious that this is what he wants, he may get along reasonably well for some time, although the extravagant pressures will ultimately injure him. But if he never wanted this, if it is a completely artificial situation forced upon him, then you will see tremendous fatigue mechanism begin to develop. The person will become more and more conscious of a desire to find some escape from this intolerable pattern of events. Another type of escape mechanism will arise from over-sheltered children. When the child reaches majority and remains after this point too much over-influenced by conditions around them, particularly parental interferences, there are strong antisocial motivations created within the person. He again desires to escape. Perhaps situations make escape extremely difficult. And if his own energy do not allow him to escape or do not give him the resources to get on his own, so to say, he will gradually fall apart inside. And in this falling apart, all kinds of mysterious conditions will emerge from him. It will be as though he had opened a Pandora's box, and almost every conceivable infirmity will be loosened upon his outer life. Whenever we find negative or destructive motivations, we must have some type of selfishness. Selfishness is so mysterious and universal complete that it is almost impossible to define it. Selfishness simply begins with the will or determination to survive. And it is hard to convince anyone that he shouldn't have this drive. Selfishness may appear to be the only natural requirements of life, things we should all have and should not feel guilty because we strive to secure them. But selfishness very often leads to a series of actions which in turn build up character patterns. And the selfish person is very often under selfish drive or motivation which will endure throughout their entire lifetime. If selfishness goes beyond another form, we are almost certain to face some of the most complicated and disastrous consequences that can be imagined. A norm of selfishness, perhaps, is a reasonable degree of self-expression, that the individual maintains the right to be himself, to express his own convictions and his own principles in a simple, constructive, direct manner, that he is entitled to the product of his own earning, that he is entitled to have something to say about his own adjustment with society, that he is not merely required to forever sacrifice himself to others. A normal degree of this selfishness, when constantly associated with an abnormal degree of it in some other person, may also result in serious psychological difficulties, where the person has to give up his own reasonable rights to cater to the extreme unreasonableness of other persons. Then he has a very solid foundation for feeling that his own identity is threatened. Today in this country, however, we do not suffer so much from these threats to identity as we do from a broad program of increasing unreasonable selfishness. The person who starts out in life with the personal pronoun as most important word in their vocabulary, the individual who thinks all through year of only the relationship of other than persons in condition to his own satisfaction, the individual who lives to get what he wants at the expense of everything else, this person is almost certain to end in dilemma. So the pressures of selfishness, which is innate and almost inevitable, seems to be a continuing troublemaker, and under our present policy of life, we are educated in selfishness. We are taught to be selfish. And when a world of selfish people tries to get along with itself, there can be only confusion. There are some people more selfish than others. The answer again is the strength of psychic drive. The person who has a tremendous intensity to have his own way, willfulness, so to say, nearly always is born with this. I do not favor the belief that all of these personality defects can be traced to environmental causes. All too simple biological heredity. Persons are born persons. They are born with pressures, which they must either learn to control or else the pressures will control them. I think the Buddhist point of view in this is the most reasonable. They believe that we are only here because of pressure. If we were not abnormally pressureful in some way, we would be reposing peacefully in nirvana. The reason we are here is because there is something wrong with us. Therefore, let's all get together and enjoy it. Perfection is not bestowed upon one or any. No individual in this world can be absolutely perfect and be here. Well, of course, there is a reasonable degree between a reasonable degree of imperfection and an abuse of the privilege. And some person seems to take it for granted that it is the imperfection that must be sustained, not the person. We are born very often with attitudes which are open to early conditioning. The person born selfish begins to assert this at a tender age. In fact, he is very likely to be well established before he gets out of his creep. Very soon, he discovers that a continuous application of self-interest will have a demoralizing effect upon his parents. The more stubborn, selfish, self-centered, and impossible he is, the more he will attain his purposes. His family will not want to be inconvenienced and made miserable trying to correct an incorrigible. By degrees, they let him get away with it. And if he finds before he's 5 years old that all he needs in order to get what he wants is a bad disposition, it will cultivate it rapidly and enthusiastically. In other times, these incorrigibles came into life just as they do now. But the world into which they came took a little different attitude towards them. Some of these children were brought into line by the older severe disciplines which marked our way of life in Western living up to the 20th century. Although such severe disciplines are still being performed in some other parts of the world, particularly in West Africa. With the grand concept of spare the rod and spoil the child, the young Impossibles was not able to maintain himself so effectively. He soon learned that when he did what was wrong, he was subject to immediate punishment. Unless his will was extraordinarily strong, it was usually brought into line. He became aware that in this world, you cannot always do as you please. This is a tremendous discovery, highly therapeutic. But of course, if it did not come into the family as nervous as the children of today come into, if he remains completely incorrigible, society moved in on him. Antisocial activities were subject to immediate punishment of the most drastic type. Back in good old 16th and 17th century England, a thief could be publicly executed for stealing one loaf of bread. This did not make the individual any more honest, probably, but it certainly made him more careful. He found the tremendous pressure of society armed against him. He may break through to be a dictator or a tyrant of some kind, but usually the pressures of living, lack of opportunity, and the intense guile training in which most young people passed, all these together brought him into line. He had to restrict selfishness. Today, he is less inclined to do so. Consequently, he reaches maturity undisciplined. By that time, it is very difficult for him to discipline himself. Motivations of selfishness lie behind human tragedies today. A negative type of motivation, which is also present, is just simply old-fashioned ignorance. We have this feeling that with the high degree of literacy in this country, we shouldn't suffer much from ignorance, but we do. We suffer from the kind of ignorance which makes the individual unable to find a reasonable solution to his own problem. He has no patterns, no rules, no guides. He is unable to depend upon any strong system to give strength to him in moments of emergency. He is not tightly fitted into the social patterns as he once was. He is not required to fall into certain practices and habits which once directed his endeavors. With more freedom than he ever enjoyed before, he is left in a dilemma of being free to suffer from his own ignorance, and there is nothing much he can do about it. At the time when these matters are most vital to him, he is scarcely at a philosophic age in which he can adjust or adapt his mind to logical procedures. Therefore, it seems to me that throughout education, any subject that is taught, even reading, writing, and arithmetic, should be taught in the way by which the individual develops some moral overtone, some insight, some concept of how to conduct his own life. That learning should be so completely impersonal that student cannot even apply knowledge to himself is lamentable. But many grow up with this problem. Under the pressure of ignorance, the person develops another kind of motivation, and that is just simple confusion. Many persons today live their entire life on the core of confusion within themselves. They have no footings, they have no strength with which to meet the challenge of circumstances or any pressure of temptation whatsoever. It has come finally to reach the degree in which subconsciously more persons all the time are doubting that there is any reason either for existence or for personal conduct. The answer seems to be simply to drift as comfortably as possible through an uncomfortable situation. Under this type of motivation, the individual turns within himself and finds only a fogginess. We cannot have much therapy from the individual. And as the world is becoming more and more composed of this type, we do not gain very much by leaning on each other. It is simply more uncertainty assembled in one place. Another motivation behind many of our pressures today is the success syndrome. This success pattern has been set up in a way to cause persons to measure their own lives in terms of the lives of other people. We are not aware of the basic individuality of man. This is a period of, we might almost say, conformities. Individuals want to be like everyone else, particularly the successful level. But because of the laws of individuality, because we no longer actually measure things in terms of our own abilities, we are inclined to develop a great deal of jealousy. We're inclined to be poorly adjusted, bitter against society, and envious of the few who seems to be highly successful. The success syndrome has also affected education. One of the marvels of life is that we are expected to choose our education in those years that we have no idea of what we want to be in most cases. Today, the selection of a career for most young people is a family project. Everyone settles down and tries to figure it out. If father has been particularly successful in some line of business, it will certainly like at least one of his sons to follow in his footsteps. Today, this is by no means a certainty. Young people see so much of the pain and misery arising from the desperate effort to succeed that they do not want to fall into the same pattern themselves. They do not want to be like their own parents who have given years of misery to a situation that has produced very little. So the young person starts out on his own. The great thought underlining everything today is to select a highly lucrative profession. The person to get along today must be in one of the money-making brackets. It is almost inconceivable that a student will go to a university counselor or something of that kind and say, "What course can I take so that I would stay poor?" This is just unbelievable. As a result, those courses, which perhaps has the greatest social significance, have very few students. Those forms of education which will fit the individual to serve others are neglected in favor of those which would help the person to be an immediate success himself. As a natural consequence, millions of young people are being forced into careers which their minds and hearts and abilities are not suited. Many of them become dropouts. Most of them are unable to complete their work successfully in a major institution, so they have to go to secondary education. We consider for a little while what some of these problems really can be and are. And if we find that we have some clue to work with, we will usually discover that what we need is moral support. We can change more easily if we can tell ourselves the importance of change. If we cannot convince ourselves that there are better things we can do and that there is a better person in us than we know, we will almost certainly drift on as we are. What can we do to help to recognize the integrities of life? In the old days, our greatest support in these matters was our faith. We did believe in the Ten Commandments. We also believe in certain examples taught by those who we regarded as spiritually mature persons. Although the intensity of spiritual faith is still being practiced today among certain minority groups, so we had a little religion with which we could console ourselves. And from this came a situation not too dissimilar to that we find in today's Alcoholics Anonymous. The theory behind Alcoholics Anonymous is simply the belief in the power of God, strengthening the power of the individual to change himself. If we believe in prayer, if we believe in communion with the higher principles of universal reality, and we believe that these powers can intercede for us or can support us, or that a divine power within us is strong enough to achieve a victory of principle over compromise, if we believe these and really work with it, we can very often achieve a tremendous amount of internal normalization. The trouble probably today is that for the most part, faith is not this intense. The individual has a general belief in, but is seldom, if ever, puts his weight upon this, depending on it for any great amount of help under a specific incident. We're more likely to seek help in sorrow or bereavement than we are in the development of character. The only thing that we can do is therefore to turn to a constructive philosophy of life. We can begin to convince ourselves of the orderly nature of the world in which we live. An individual who convinces himself will obey that of which he has convinced himself. It will not react well to the advice of other people. But if it can be made to convince himself, he will find that he has the strength to do these things that he now believes to be best. To convince himself today, the average person must have an intelligent philosophy of life. It cannot depend upon platitudes, upon vain assumptions, and in our time, because we are so closely associated with science, it is often easier to build a philosophy upon scientific concepts than upon theological concepts. Here again, I think the Buddhist doctrine is the most compatible with science. If we can convince ourselves beyond all doubt that we live in a world of cause and effect, if we can believe that we will be rewarded or punished according to the merits of conduct, if we can get every other thought out of our minds and gradually escape from these negative attitudes of trying to get away with something because nobody cares anyway, if the person who is selfish, recognizing that he is selfish, and he can discover this with reasonable ease, if he is not quite certain, his friends will tell him. If he has an abominable disposition, someone will remind him of it. Up to now, he has cut that person from his list of friends. He does not want to be reminded. But as Socrates pointed out, the greatest friend is the one who does tell us our faults. If the person then really believes and knows that he is selfish or self-centered, neurotic, or has any one of 100 different pressures within himself, the only thing he really has to learn to believe that these abnormalities, these delinquencies, these useless intensities can never produce anything except the trouble which is innate in them. That there are causes, and that these causes must have their effects. The cause of selfishness must result in the penalties which nature has reserved for selfishness. These penalties are loneliness, failure, misery, and sorrow. If the individual will accept that any negative attitude of his own, any unreasonable or destructive policy which he follows must inevitably hurt him, that as he allows these negative situations to control his inner life, he is making an inevitable failure out of his outer life, that if he wishes to be happy, he must cause happiness. If he wishes to share in the joys of others, he must permit others to share in his joys. If he wants to have friends, he must be a friend. If he wants to succeed in an honorable profession, he must be honorable. If he wants others to be honest, he must be honest. And if he wants a good home and a good family, he must deserve these things. There is no other way. There is no escape from these, and science will support this. It will not support it on a moral level, but it will support it on the scientific level of the immutability and the inevitability of the principle of causality. That just as surely as The laboratory depends upon cause and effects in every research it carries on, just as surely as the astronomer and the physicist live in a world which cause and effect is accepted. It isn't even questioned. It is part of the very equipment by means of which progress is achieved. If we can realize this, we will gain. If we can look back a little into the examples, we will see the working of cause and effect. And if we will trace superficially even our own experiences, we will see how these laws operate on our own flesh. There is no evading it. This is our golden opportunity. This is the marvelous things about nature. But just as surely as nature will penalize a broken rule and the one who breaks it, so nature supports and sustains that which keeps the rules. And one thing that the law of causality and its moral and ethical faces reveal to us is that we do not have to wait for the world to get better. We do not have to wait until the world solves problems before we can solve ours. We are never this much attached to or part of our world. The world was in trouble before we were born. The world will be in trouble after we're long gone. The world will be in trouble all the time that we live. But we are actually tourists. We are here for a while, for a time. We mingle with the streams of our own consciousness, with worldly affairs. Then they separate and our streams return to ourselves. Our own growth is not the result of the world primarily. Our own growth is the result of the internal life of the individual moving through circumstances. And the world is one of these circumstances. The person can control himself because the only power which can achieve this is within himself. It is not as a result of delegation of authority. It has nothing to do with politics. It does not make any difference what condition the world is in. The person can control himself. And any moment between the rise of his own individual initiative and his passing out of life, and in any moment in the history of mankind, it simply requires the person making the necessary endeavor. The moment we know that our motivations are wrong, we are really saying that we are setting up bad causations. A motivation is to us a causation. Whatever is motivated by a wrong motive will come to trouble. The Greeks made a point of motive, and the old religious writings of the world remind us always that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And this is one of the burdens of Socratic system of philosophy. It is not what a man does that is the final judge of his character. It is the motive within him. If the motive is good, good will ultimately come even though the efforts themselves are clumsy. Perhaps in his effort to do good, it will make a mistake. But if his motive is right, it will gain from his mistake the insight and wisdom to go on and correct it. If the motivation is wrong, it makes no difference how noble the cause may appear to be. If it is inspired by ulterior motive, it will fail. We know the old adage, those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. Nearly every nation of the world has been raised by the sword, and nearly every nation of history so far recorded has died by the sword. The only hope is right motivation, right causation set in motion. The person who wishes to be selfish only long enough to get what he wants, and then he is going to be unselfish, never achieves this, because the basic motive is wrong. The individual who lives for wrong principles is one who breaks the rules of his total nature in order to gratify the whims of some part of his nature. If he does this, he is destroying his integrity as a complete person. If we can get these people who are suffering from wrong motives to believe sincerely that their motives are going to determine inevitably their futures, not only in this world, but in the whole total universal existence, we might be able to get a philosophy operating in Western life that will be of some immediate value to us. We have to have a reason to be honest that is stronger than the apparent advantages of being dishonest. We can no longer be held by laws and rules. We can no longer be frightened into a kind of new obedience. Even if we are, this is not the answer. A man who is frightened into a state of grace is not very graceful. Actually, this change has to arise through insight, through the recognition that this world of lowly, frustrated, isolated, confused, complicated, sick, and miserable people is a monument to wrong principles. And no matter how well we have been instructed in these wrong principles, they are still wrong. And though 1,000 shall encourage us to follow them, they are still wrong. If everybody else does it, and it is still wrong, it is still wrong, and no one is going to win. We have always labored under the hope that as individuals, we are going to be exceptions to the rules of life. Other people cannot get away with selfishness, but we will. Other persons should never gossip, but we have the divine right to do so. This belief that we are different, that the laws of cause and effect do not apply to us, or that by some way we shall avoid them, has been wrong and continues wrong. Here we had a little religious problem. For a long time, people believed firmly that religion was a position to expiate the laws of cause and effect. If you made a serious blunder, or you did something very bad, you would go and tell your clergyman, and it could give you some kind of absolution, pat you on the head, and tell you to go forth and sin no more. So you probably went forth and sinned some more. Any belief which even permits religion to wipe out the values of cause and effect will ultimately destroy the integrity of man. We cannot even pray ourselves out of these things. We can be sorry for what we have done, and a good thought, right, honest repentance may be enough to prevent us from repeating it. If so, it has achieved its purpose. The next thing to do, right, of course, is to be sorry to do wrong. But there is no good second to do right in the first place. In midstream, we can start out with brand new, pristine, pure careers. We've all made mistakes. We've all done things that are not good for us or for other people. There is barely little to be gained by repentance at the stage in living. We can be sorry if we are justly and honorably sorry. It helps a little, but the real purpose of sorrow or repentance is to remind us of what wasn't right. We can, however, start at any time we want to make such changes as we deem necessary. Our principal adversary will be habit. We have done certain things so long that it is hard not to do them. Instinctively, we fall into the old faults again. With watchfulness, however, we can escape most of these problems inasmuch as habit has to be sustained by attitude. And if the attitude ceases within individuals, a habit which he no longer believes in will not endure very long. If it doesn't believe in it, if it doesn't want it, if it rejects it as a policy for living, this habit will cease because it is not vitalized, it is not energized. But if it has no internal strength and simply wishes it could stop making the mistakes, then the habit pattern will be more stronger than the wishing, and it will go on just the way it is. So, we like to think that the best way to get out of this is to get back into the concept of an honest universe. It is perhaps more difficult for us in a society which we do not trust to be aware of a universal justice that we can trust. When everyone around us seems to be compromising, we have to get back to values to find out what cannot be compromised. We have to realize, perhaps, by going out and looking at the mountain that stands against the sky, or the endless motion of the heavens itself. We have to come to sense that there is something bigger than this little civilization which we have built up and gradually tearing down. That the great principles of existence remain unchangeable. That if man is contrary to these principles, man's civilization will vanish. The laws will go on. The law breakers will fade away. But we do not always have this peculiar courage of naturalness. We cannot simply separate inevitables from the little confusions and conspiracies of human beings. We sort of feel they are all bound together. And when we see dishonesty in acts of men, we are beholding the wickedness of God. This is not true, but we feel that way. The only way to get out of that kind of feeling is to shift the center of attention and consciousness to these things which do not change. There is no important fact of humanity. There has been no time in the history of the world which bad has been good and good has been bad. There are times when men had worse policies, perhaps, than they have now, and tried to justify them. But trying to justify bad policies, these men have vanished away in limbo. The answer we all have to come to is finally to make peace with the rules of the game, to make peace with principles, accepting them, and then, as a result, relaxing. We do not have to fight for these principles because these principles cannot be destroyed by ourselves or anyone else. All we have to do is to accept a plan that is intelligent and live according to it. If we will do this, we will lower these motivations which cannot endure the censorship of our own integrity. Now, you may say, this is pretty rough going. And I think probably most people will find that it is rough going. But everything that is worth doing takes some kind of effort. The individual will cheerfully go back to school in order to get a degree in electronic and suffer and strain his mind and his disposition and his family resources for years in the hope of getting an extra £100 a week when he graduates. Anyone who will do this can also change himself if he wants to. The only problem is he doesn't see £100 a week in changing himself. He doesn't see that this is going to push him forward into the great world of successful failures. The resources are there. However, the individual can do what he wants to do. When he wants to do what is right, it will cease to be a neurotic. Until then, all the doctors and psychologists of the world can't save him. Thus, in motivation, we have to clear them out. We have to clean them. We have to reorganize them. We have to get behind our lives positive, constructive, creative motivations. We have to find reasons for living that really excites us just a little bit. Reasons for living that make life a valuable, useful experience for which we are grateful. We cannot go along being sorry for ourselves and more miserable every day and get anything out of life except sad and tragic cycle of misery. We do, however, have the right to take hold of this life and make it important. Not important in terms of merely of human rewards, but important in the term of total reward. Let's go back for a moment to the young man who hopes to make an extra £100 a week by going into these specialized fields. He is perfectly aware that by the time he graduates, the course has been changed behind him. He knows that within 5 or 10 years, all that he knows will be obsolete. They probably have to go back to study again. An applicant for a job in an electronic concern was told not long ago that he will have to go back to school regularly for the rest of his life to keep the job. He is also reminded that the detrimental things to keeping his job will be anything that takes his mind off of it. Therefore, his family must be prepared to have him at school in all his spare time. His family will be lucky if they get a sight of him on Sunday. His children will never know their own father very well. They will only know that there is someone that comes and goes in a desperate effort to keep up with the job. This individual is chaining himself to what? He is chaining himself to the complete submergence of his own life and identity for £100 a week. That's £100 a week more than the pay of one lesser cultivated and lesser qualified. So in the end, perhaps this man at 45 or 50 will reach the goal of the young optimist of today, who would be in the executive brackets with 50 or 100,000 pounds a year salary. It will still be going to school. It will still be eating, sleeping, living, thinking nothing but transistors and hookups. It is very possible that whilst he's doing postgraduate work, learning a little more about transistors and hookups, it will drop dead. Now, the Greeks were firmly of the belief that man learns until he dies. This is perfectly proper, but there's a little question about ultimate utility of some of this information. When the individual drops out of this world, what would happen to his hookups and transistors? Well, one might say, in terms of the good old belief that he is getting ready for the next time, that it will come back in another embodiment, practically the personification of an embodiment of transistors and hookups. It will be so nobly cultured in these things that it will be the wonder of the ages. But when it comes back, it will be the wonder of the past ages only. For the reason that by the time it gets back, there would have been one single thing that is learned that will be better than totally obsolete. If he cannot keep up with the progress while he's alive, even if he's only out of this world for 20 years, he will come back and have to start all over again. Because what is learned will be of comparative no value to him, even if he could remember it. So what is it all about? There will always be people who insist on doing these things because they do not know any better. They think they are pretty smart, but there are others who can wake up to the importance of making life itself important. The importance of good books, the importance of kindly friends, of the appreciation of great hearts, of a deep and supporting religion, the importance of a gracious life lived within the patterns of ideals and principles. These important things are the most vital consideration of modern man. And if he has no time for them, and for lack of them, he is slowly extinguishing his own world. So, it is suggested very strongly that the individual begin to think in terms of cause and effect in himself. And whatever habit or practice is contrary to the dignity of his own nature, is contrary to the beauty, the continuing peace and happiness of himself and those around him, where he finds that his attitudes are only bringing pain, suspicion, doubts, trouble, jealousy, there is no earthly reason to maintain these attitudes because they have no lasting value in themselves. They consist of a moment of gratification, of desire, and a future of uncertain compensations. Compensations that have to be pretty miserable. So, get out these submerged motives if you can, clear them up, trace them to their source, and then settle down to the quiet improvement of your own mind and nature in those blank areas of your thinking and feeling where these troubles can originate. They do not originate in the strong, noble parts of your nature. They originate in blind spots. They originate in doubts, in fears, uncertainties, and negations of all kinds. They originate in weakness. And the only cure for weakness is the development of internal strength and resource. If you will follow these thoughts, trace your own weaknesses, accept them, and resolve to strengthen the areas of value, you will not have to constantly defend your own standing. It will reveal itself as adequate to other people. So, if you really want a little more happiness as you go along, a little more security and value in life, build a philosophy of life that can support you. Build convictions that will sustain your right motives and build your personal way of life upon immutable principles of the universal and divine law. For only in these principles are the securities of existence to be found. Cling to principles, and the rest of life will take care of itself. Depart from principles, and nothing else will go well. This is the basic conception and value, and we hope it will help you to get new resolution, to do better things, and to do them more graciously as a way of protecting your own survival, your health, your happiness, your loved ones. And for these are the problems of our day. Well, time is up, so we thank you.